So we are continuing the series today that we've been in called Different. And if you haven't been with us, or if you have and you need a reminder, the main idea for this is that God wants us to bring heaven to earth. That as individuals and as a community together, that we would be salt and we would be light. We would go into dark places or broken places on this earth. And as a result of our presence there, we would make them look more like heaven. Jesus said, when you pray, pray like this. Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Where? On earth as it is in heaven. And what is God's primary way of bringing heaven to earth? How does it come? It comes through people. It comes through you and me. It comes through any of those that are willing to seek him and serve him. But in order to do that, it means we can't live just like this world. Like to bring heaven to this world, we can't live just like this world. Something about us then has to be different. And today, I want to talk about something that really characterizes and defines much of our world. We live in a world saturated with pride. Okay, it's saturated with pride. On my way up here, Tony said something about he whispered to me on my way up here, something like, go kill it, big dog. And I was like, that's right. So today I want to talk about pride. And I want to give you some characteristics of pride and see if any of these characteristics sort of conjures to your mind a person that you might know. Maybe you know someone who always makes the conversation about them. Like you're telling your story or someone else in the group is telling their story and this person just kind of jumps in and takes over. And pretty soon, no matter what we're talking about, the conversation is always about them. Or maybe you know someone who one-ups everything in a conversation. Like you talk about something cool, they've got something cooler. You talk about how you're going through something hard, oh, that's nothing. They've gone through something harder. You share a story that's funny, and they're like, oh, you think that's funny? And they share their story. Isn't that awesome when people do that? Maybe you know someone who is just competing with you nonstop. And you get the sense that your success is their failure. Or maybe you know somebody who constantly puts you down, like they're just trying to keep you in your place. And so they speak to you very condescendingly. They're just belittling all the time. Or maybe you know somebody who is always trying to prove to the world that they are smart. And they use the biggest words possible. Because they're in love with their own intellect. They love to hear themselves talk or speak, or they love to hear themselves blog or post stuff that's clever or witty or smart. Or maybe you know somebody who will step on anyone. Like their whole life is just an exercise in ladder climbing. And they will step on whoever they need to step on to get to that next rung. Or maybe you know someone who won't be associated with you. Because you are too low on the hierarchy, whatever the hierarchy is, you're too low on it to be seen with you. Until, of course, there's no one else around and they feel lonely, then they're your best friend in the world. Maybe you know someone that does really nice things for people, but then they absolutely have to post about it afterwards. And you've realized the only reason they do nice things is to get people to say, oh my goodness, you're such a sweet, kind person. You're amazing. They're like, oh, it's nothing. Or maybe you know somebody who will post pictures online all the time, but it's always from this angle. Why? Because we all look 20 years younger and 50 pounds lighter, right? From that angle. Maybe you know somebody that uses a super inflated job title. You ask them what they do. They're talking about work and they tell you that they're a cultural architect that coaches spirituality and personal development. And you find out really it's just like the pastor at Brookview. Right? I mean, the job title thing is nuts to me at times. We live in a world, right, that is just kind of saturated with pride. Now, as I kind of read through this list, how many of you had, at least in one of those descriptions, someone sort of came to mind to you? Yeah. I mean, pride is something that we see all around us, and it's so easy to notice in someone else. But here's the tricky thing. We are usually blind to pride in ourselves. Like, we despise pride when we see it in others, and yet rarely do we imagine that we might be guilty of it ourselves. Yet no human being is free from this like internal battle that we're all wrestling with all the time. It's natural, it's human nature, and it is deeply ingrained in our world. It's happening all around us all the time, whether we know it or not, and it's happening within us. So let me ask you a question that I think illustrates this. When you like first look at a group photo that you're in, okay, it's a group photo that you're in, who is the first person in that photo that you look at? Absolutely. You want to know, how do I look, right? And what's the primary factor in determining for you whether or not that happens to be a good picture? It's how you look, right? Now, I ran into this a few weeks ago. Kate was home, and so all the kids were around. We're in the living room, and Jen and I and the kids were kind of looking through some old photo albums and family photos, and we came across this one of the five of us, and I said, wow, I like that picture. That's a really good picture of us. And so Kate was like, oh, really? So she looks over my shoulder, and she's like, Dad, that's a terrible picture of us. And so, you guys, I took a closer look. She was right. It was awful. Like, the only person that looked good in the photo was me. Everyone else looked horrible. I mean, it was embarrassing. I look at the photo, and Cam's like, and Brooklyn's like, and Jen's just like, Kate's, I don't even know what Kate was doing. And I'm like, she's just like, oh, I don't think that's a very good picture. And she moved on. I was like, that was so prideful of me. And you didn't even call me out. She was so sweet about it. But pride can be present in us, and we have no idea. We're so blind to it. And if you want to find out how proud you are, then ask yourself this: how much does it bug me when other people talk down to me? Or they ignore me, or they insult me, or they steal credit from me? How much does it bug me when someone else shows off? See, the more pride you have, then the more someone else's pride is going to drive you nuts. Because your pride is in competition with everybody else's pride. It's because I really wanted to shine that it bugs me when someone outshines me. And if they know they're good, or even worse, if they think they're better than me, that puts me over the top. Why? Because my pride is competing with everybody else's pride. And this kind of leads to the real darkness and the real substance of the issue. And that is that pride is always divisive. The essence of pride is competition, okay, and division. Because if I'm competing with you, then your success will be my failure, and your failure will be my success. That's dark. I mean, pride is competitive by nature. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something. It only gets pleasure out of having more of it than someone else. I mean, sometimes we talk as if people are proud of being rich, or they're proud of being smart, or they're proud of being good looking, or they're proud of whatever. They're not. That's not how pride works. They're proud of being richer. They're proud of being smarter. They're proud of being better looking. It's the comparison that leads to pride. So the essence of what pride does when we're filled up with this is it makes everybody else around me my competitors. And when my pride is flared up and it's really in effect, here's what happens. I'm not rooting for you. And this is why pride is so divisive. It is, when you think of it, really, it is like an anti-love state of mind. If love is simply this, it's wanting and working for the best for someone else, then as long as I'm competing with them and I'm wanting them to fail and I'm wanting to outshine them, I can't love them. Now, before some of you are like, oh, wait a minute. I just want to say for a second that I don't believe that all competition is evil. If you know me, you know that I don't believe that. I love sports, get my kids involved in sports. Because there is a time for competition, right? You know, playing cards, playing board games, having some competition of some kind around the house, whatever. All of that stuff is fun and all that stuff is cool. And there is a time for good-hearted competition. But I think we need to be aware that anytime you're competing, right, you're not rooting for your opponent. That's the nature of competition. And when that competition doesn't stop at, say, the golf course or the board game or the particular activity you're engaged in, okay, when it's about something like, who scored the hotter wife, right? Or who has the nicer car, or who has the better job, or the nicer house, or who's funnier, or who's more successful. When it just sort of pours into every arena of life, that's divisive, and it starts destroying relationships. And this is why the ancients, like the fathers of the faith, thought deeply, when they were thinking deeply about sin, they believed this. This is what they said. They said that pride is the mother of all sins. I mean, you think about all the different sins we can engage in, and they're all bad, and we should avoid them, but this is like the mother of them all. You guys have heard of the 7 deadly sins, right? Pride is considered to be the deadliest of all. Pride is how the devil became the devil. The idea, for those of you that don't know, the idea is that Satan was actually created by God as a magnificent angel, the most magnificent. But Satan became jealous of God's glory, wanted to be the most glorious creature of all. Now, there's not a ton in the Bible on this. It really comes from Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. But here's a few of the verses from Isaiah. It says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O shining star, son of the morning. You have been thrown down to the earth, you who destroyed the nations of the world. For you said to yourself, I will ascend to heaven and set my throne above God's stars. I will preside on the mountain of the gods far away in the north. I will climb to the highest heavens and be like the Most High." Pride is how the devil became the devil, and it always divides. Not just person from person, but when you think about it, pride actually cuts us off from God himself. And this is why pride is the mother of all sins. C.S. Lewis probably wrote the greatest thing that I've ever read on pride, and he says this. He says, "In God, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people, and of course, as long as you're looking down, you cannot see something that is above you." And that raises a terrible question. And this is something that the non-Christian world has looked at the church and said, this is the problem we see. He says, "How is it that people who are quite obviously eaten up with pride can say they believe in God and appear to themselves as very religious? I'm afraid it means they are worshiping an imaginary God. They theoretically admit themselves to be nothing in the presence of this phantom God, but are really all the time imagining how he approves of them and thinks them far better than ordinary people. I suppose it was of those people Christ was thinking when he said that some would preach about him and cast out devils in his name, only to be told at the end of the world that he had never known them. And any of us," he says, "and any of us may at any moment be in this death trap." Now, maybe you're here this morning and you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't struggle with pride. If anything, I'm like, if you knew me, you'd know, I'm like the opposite of proud. Like, I struggle with insecurity, actually. I often lack confidence, and I feel insecure, and I'm jealous of people who are so confident, and because I'm not. I just want to say pride doesn't always manifest itself as confidence and arrogance and superiority. Pride discreetly disguises itself as insecurity. Pride is about this innate desire that we have to compete with other people and compare ourselves to them. And when we compete with others, we can win or we can lose. The boastful, arrogant person is the person that feels like they're winning. The insecure, inferior, like, man, I really suck person is the person who feels like they're losing. But what is the opposite of pride? What's the opposite of pride? Anybody? Humility. The opposite of pride is humility. The opposite of pride is not inferiority. Those are very, very different. The humble person isn't competing and comparing. That's the whole point of what it is to be humble. The humble person is free. They're free to know you, free to celebrate you, free to be impressed by you, free to root for you. Why? Because your success is not their failure. It isn't about them. Whatever's going on with you, it has nothing to do with them and their worth. That's humility. John Piper writes this. He says, consider the relationship between boasting and self-pity. Both are manifestations of pride. Boasting is a response of pride to success. Self-pity is a response of pride to suffering. Boasting says, I deserve admiration because I've achieved so much. Self-pity says, I deserve admiration because I've sacrificed so much. Boasting is the voice of pride in the heart of the strong. Self-pity is the voice of pride in the heart of the weak. Boasting sounds self-sufficient. Self-pity sounds self-sacrificing. The reason self-pity does not look like pride is that it appears to be needy. But the need arises from a wounded ego, and the desire of self-pity is not for others to see that they are helpless, but actually that they're heroes. The need self-pity feels does not come from a sense of unworthiness, but a sense of unrecognized worthiness. It is the response of unapplauded pride. Pride secretly disguises itself as insecurity. And guys, whether we're on the weak side of the thing or the strong side, it's still pride. It still means that we're comparing and we're competing. And whether we feel like winners or losers, it is a big fat problem either way. It's divisive either way. And we live in a world, and we feel it all the time, that is saturated with pride. And this is where Jesus is calling us to become something different. Jesus showed us a completely different way. Jesus modeled for us and showed us the way of humility. I mean, if you look at Jesus was never about self-promotion. He was never about self-glorification. Jesus wasn't concerned with looking impressive. Jesus was free to truly just love people, serve people. And Jesus is inviting us to follow him. And this morning, I want to read some powerful words about the Jesus way, and this comes from the Apostle Paul. And this is awesome. These words are awesome. So would you stand just in respect and reverence for these words? Paul writes this. He says, don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. He says, you must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. And here scholars believe that he was quoting a creed that had been around for a long time before Paul even. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. He says, though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. And then we're told right after this that God exalted him to the highest place of honor, that God gave him the name that is above every name. Okay, you can be seated. Now this is really, if this is true, This is an extraordinary idea, I think. I mean, let's look again at verse 6. I want to kind of camp on this verse. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Now, the Greek word that gets translated like to cling to is an interesting word. The only place that it's used in the entire Bible is in this verse in Philippians. And it's most often translated to cling or to clutch or to grasp. And the concept behind this word is really, I think, the key to learning to live with humility. In Greek culture at the time of Jesus, this word would get used in several different ways. For one thing, it meant clutching to something that's mine. Okay, so refusing to let go and give it up. Somebody's coming after something and I've got to hold on to it because it's mine. And then second, it meant grasping for something that I don't yet have. So reaching and striving and clamoring for something that I want. And then third, it meant using an advantage to promote yourself or to exploit others. Like using some advantage that you have over someone else to step on them and climb higher than them. So it means clutching, essentially, rather than holding something kind of loosely. It means grasping at something rather than waiting for it to come. And it means using an advantage to promote yourself or to climb instead of using that advantage that you have to bless someone else and to lift them up. So these were the things that Paul is saying that Jesus refused to do. He didn't clutch onto his divinity and its power, his glory. He held it loosely. He lived humbly as a servant to all. He didn't grasp for everybody to recognize his greatness. He waited for God in God's time to exalt him, to eventually give him the name that's above every name. And he certainly didn't use his divinity as power just to promote himself. In fact, his disciples often couldn't understand what in the world he was doing, right? Because they'd seen the power that he held, they'd seen the glory, and they wanted him to use it to reveal himself to the world, to get everybody on board with the program. But again and again, he refused to power up, and instead, he chose to power down. Though he was, in fact, God in the flesh, he became the embodiment of a slave, a servant. Now notice, this is like the exact opposite mindset of Satan. The way of the evil one is to clutch and to grasp and to exploit. The way of Jesus is to let go of all of that and serve. So how in the world do you and I actually begin to live the way of Jesus? I mean, pride is a big deal. Pride is hard. I've been wrestling with this for 20 years since I became aware that it was an issue for me, and now I'm even more aware that it's an issue, especially when I'm looking at family photos and stuff. How do we do something about this? Knowing it's a problem is one thing. Doing something, that's hard. How in the world do we embrace humility? And I think it simply begins with this. What if we refuse to clutch, but held things loosely? Then when it's time to let go, we just let go. See, when we're constantly competing for position or for status, then we have to be really concerned about people that might be ready to climb past us. What if they become more than us? Well, what if they surpass us? What if they take from us what we feel belongs to us? Jesus shows that it's actually freeing to just let go of all that, to hold things loosely. So what if they exceed us, really? So what if we aren't recognized? So what if someone else becomes glorified and we're not? It's interesting. One time Jesus was talking about John the Baptist. And Jesus said this. He said, "Of those born of a woman, there is none greater than John." And I'm like, that's sort of a Yoda way to say it. I mean, he's just saying, John is the greatest person to have ever lived. Because a little insight, all of us, at least in his day, were born of a woman. Now, why would Jesus say that about John? What was it about John that was so great? Well, the truth is, it's not explained. I have no idea what Jesus had in mind when he said this, but here's what I do know. Like Jesus, John had this ability to hold things loosely. Like he didn't clutch and cling and hold tightly to his own status. If you remember, prior to Jesus growing in renown and celebrity, John was kind of a rock star in Israel. He was like the man. He was preaching like a boss. Yes, sir. People were coming to hear him by the droves, like by the thousands, and he was baptizing them. He was baptizing people by the thousands. John became like this legendary prophet preacher guy. And then over time, Jesus started attracting John's crowds. And much more than that, in fact. Jesus was preaching better than John. Jesus was also healing people. John is like, I wasn't able to do that. Jesus was healing the blind and the deaf and lepers. Jesus was bringing people back from the dead. Jesus fed thousands with just a few fish and loaves. Jesus rebuked storms and cast out demons. And so one day, John's disciples, they're getting concerned about all this. And so they come to him and they say, man, have you seen what Jesus and his guys are doing over there? His guys are like John. His guys are baptizing people. Isn't that like your thing? I mean, seriously, you're John the Baptist. So, what's going on? They're stealing your material. They're plagiarizing your program. Do you want us to go over there and try to shut that thing down? And the response of John, if you remember, the response of John was so dang Christ-like. If you remember what John said, he was like, you know what, guys? It doesn't bother me one bit. I had my time, and now it's his time. And John said this. He simply said, he must become greater, I must become less. What is it that made John the greatest? Well, maybe part of it was that he had found the ability to hold things loosely. But God had exalted him in his time, but now God was exalting Jesus, and his role needed to shift, and he was perfectly comfortable shifting. John let God do the exalting, and he just refused to clutch. And you think about it and you go, man, what would it look like if every Christian, in every workplace or on every sports team or in every venue, actually embraced this mindset? What if instead of clutching and holding and clawing and scratching, what if we just sought out ways to see other people succeed? But this is not how the world works, right? This is different. And yet this is something that people are powerfully drawn to when they actually see it. Someone that's rooting for us, even if we outshine them, this is different. This is beautiful. To hold loosely, praise and recognition come, and then this ability to yeah, but I got to let it go. This is true freedom. And this is what brings life. This is love. Now, how do we let go of pride and embrace humility? Well, I think it just begins with, what if we refuse to clutch, but learn somehow to hold things loosely? And then second, what if we learn to walk humbly through the valleys of obscurity? Some of you know, if you know me well or if you've been around the church for a long time, you know that one of the toughest seasons for me, one of the toughest seasons of anybody's life, right, is a season when you find yourself getting no recognition. What do you do when no one is recognizing you? What do you do when you're walking through this valley of obscurity? Maybe you find yourself in that season right now. So you know that you're capable of great things. You know you're capable of great things. Maybe you're even doing great things, but you aren't getting more opportunities. You're not getting praised. You're not getting recognized. You feel unseen. You feel unknown, unrecognized. How you handle that says so much about who you are. And I think a classic example of walking through this valley well would be David. And so often when we think of David, we think of his glory, right? We think of the high moments in his life, like defeating Goliath and becoming like famous in Israel. And we think of him leading the armies to great victories over the enemies. We think of David as this majestic king. And yet David actually spent years and years and years in the valley of obscurity. Does anyone remember what David did before he was anointed king? What did he do? He was a shepherd. He's a shepherd. Okay, you want to live in obscurity, go become a shepherd. Get some sheep, hang out with your sheep. Okay, then what did he do right after he got anointed king? What did he do after he was anointed king right away? Anybody? Like he was promised a kingdom, but he stayed a shepherd. If you remember, Samuel came and anointed him, and the dad and then his brothers were all jealous and all that. And then like, after that was over, Samuel leaves, and they're like, all right, get back and take care of the sheep. And he went right back out to the pasture to be a shepherd. And he was there for a long, long time with no end in sight, kind of living in this valley of obscurity. And what did David do in the valley? Well, David learned to get in touch with his soul, and he sought hard after God. He prayed and he wrote worship music, and he trusted God's timing. He worked on his character and he worked on his interior life. He spent very little time worrying about how much recognition he was getting. He decided to just let God take care of all of that, and he refused to grasp for what he didn't have. And this is part of what made David great. It's part of what made him a man after God's own heart. It's what prepared him to become what he eventually became. And you think about how many of the Psalms were written like when he was struggling in his life. You like when success and fame and recognition were just nowhere to be found for him. I mean, you think about his most famous words, the ones that people that hardly even know who David was will recognize. Psalm 23. And David wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures." What do you think the season of his life was that inspired those words? "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff," okay, the tools of a shepherd, "they comfort me." In the valley of obscurity, David learned to get in touch with his soul, and he sought hard after God, and God met him there. Why? Because God longs to meet us. Now, maybe some of you are finding yourselves walking through like valley of obscurity right now. Right now in your life, there just isn't a lot of recognition. Right now in your life, you're not being showered with awards. Maybe you feel it at work. Like you feel it at work because you're like, you know what, I'm killing it. No one sees it. No one's noticing. Or maybe for you right now, the bulk of job is being at home with little ones. And you are loving them and you're serving them really well with your whole heart, day after day after day. And you go to bed exhausted, day after day after day, because you have poured out love all day long, and yet no one is saying, "Mommy, you're killing it." And maybe it just feels like a pretty thankless job. For some of you, maybe you've got a sibling that's just like super successful. And when you're with your parents, you feel how proud they are. Like they brag about your brother, they brag about your sister. But you're just walking through the valley of obscurity. No one sees, no one knows, no one appreciates. See, how you walk through that valley says so much about who you are. How you walk through that valley dictates who you're becoming. Those valleys can be the most formative seasons of our lives. What do we do in the valley of obscurity? And if you're in one of those seasons right now, just here are a couple thoughts. The first is deepen your intimacy with God. Use it to deepen your intimacy with God. Okay, I was starting to tell this story earlier out of place, and I apologize. I'm coming back to it now. I was really excited to talk about myself because I'm humble. If you've been around Brookview for a few years, you've heard me talk a little bit about one of those valleys for me. Jen and I, we had the dream long ago of starting a church called Brookview, although we didn't know that that's what it would be called. We had the dream actually for 5 years before we moved here to do it. And part of that was I needed to go to school and get the training. I had a bachelor's degree in psychology, but I needed a lot more because I didn't grow up in the church. I could barely tell you at that time the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I went to grad school to study theology and Bible. And so that took three years. And then in that same time, I did an internship at our church up in Bellingham, and they gave me opportunities to teach and lead and preach. And so I was getting all this ministry experience that I very much needed. And then at the end of that, I finished grad school and I completed the internship, and we had this burning passion to move down here and start a church, but things just didn't come together like we thought they were going to. And everything ended up being delayed, and it was like super frustrating. So instead of coming here and starting the church, I got a job in an oil refinery for what I hoped at the time would be like 6 weeks, like just until we can get all these things to come together and then we can go start the church. So I took this job at an oil refinery as like the lowest level laborer. And I thought I need something temporary because this is all about to happen. But as I worked there, things just kept getting delayed and getting delayed and getting delayed. And I ended up spending almost 2 years working at the refinery. And I felt like I developed all these skills like to teach and to preach and lead. And instead, here I was, a laborer in an oil refinery. Like I was walking through the valley of obscurity. And you talk about not getting recognition. Okay, not only was I a laborer in an oil refinery, I was terrible at it. And it was not an environment of positivity. I remember one day I was sitting with my crew at break time, and like a foreman from another crew came over to talk to us. And this was a guy that I didn't know. They all knew him. I didn't know him. And he was kind of a big shot. Now, I was the lowest on the rung that you could be. In fact, my official title was, I was a helper. Got anything important to do? I can help. And for some reason, as this guy was talking to my crew, I don't know how I even remember how it came up, but somebody in my crew said, and they were kind of like talking about me, and they were kind of like proud of me. They said, hey, check this out. Jason here has a master's degree. And this foreman who didn't know me looked at me in front of everyone and said, really? You have a master's degree and you work here? He goes, you ain't too smart, are you? It's like, So you know what I said? Nothing. Right? I mean, what are you going to say? I'm just sitting there like, ugh. And for so many reasons, that season just felt like obscurity. Like every day, coveralls and a hard hat and goggles and ear protection and coming home on many days looking like a coal miner. Jen's like, babe, you got like black in your ears. I'm like, sorry. It's sexy, right? And I wasn't teaching, I wasn't preaching, I wasn't leading, wasn't doing all the things that I had worked hard to do. But that season, you guys, I have to tell you, that season was very special, and it was actually critical for me. Because in that season, I learned a ton about myself. I got in touch with my soul in a way that I never would have. And in that season, I sought after God like I never had before. Like not to prep a message or not to lead a Bible study, just to know him and be with him and walk with him. And God met me in a deep and powerful way in that valley. And I think about who I am, and I think about who God has grown me to become. And that season, that 2-year stretch in the refinery was irreplaceable in developing my soul. And to be honest with you, those are the valleys, those are the kinds of valleys when God has grown me most. I mean, I long for success and recognition. The truth is, I grow best in obscurity. And so if you find yourself in the valley of obscurity right now, then you just need to know this is a season of immense opportunity for you. If you get in touch with your soul and you seek God, he will meet you in profound ways and he will fill you. Now, you may not hear, hey, you're killing it, from someone else. But God sees, and God knows, and God cares. So in the valley of obscurity, you deepen your intimacy with God, and you get in touch with your soul. And then second, how else do we do this? We find ways to serve others. That refinery season was incredibly deepening for me because every day I discovered that I was actually working with people that God loved. And he reminded me of that every day. I love these people. And my crew then became people that I too learned to adore. They were smart, and they were funny, and they were kind, but they were also insecure, just like me. They were a lot like me. They wanted to feel respected. And a lot of the time, they didn't. So I did what I could to spend time getting to know them, and I did my best to learn to love them. And I got to know their families, and I got to know their dreams, and I prayed for them virtually every day. And sometimes when it made sense, I would actually pray with them face to face. Like they would share some dream or some fear or an area of pain. And when it made sense, it was the right person at the right time, I would just say, oh man, can I pray for you? And it's amazing because every time they would say, yes, please. And even in the valley, I saw beauty. And what I learned in the valley was that people are people. Whether they have a PhD or they barely graduated from high school, whether they make $300,000 a year or $30,000 a year, people are people. They want to be seen, they want to be heard, they want to be respected, they have fears and hopes and dreams, and they have pain. Everybody's got pain. Everybody, when you actually get into their life, you discover that they have pain. And if you can become a safe person for them, if they trust that you're rooting for them, that you have their best interest at heart, eventually they'll share that with you. And what I saw again and again is that pain is this open door for ministry. It was an open door for me to serve and to minister to them. And when I look back at my own story, I realized this is actually how God broke through to me originally. Like it was a coworker who became my friend that led me to Christ. And those of you that know my story, you've heard me talk about this in some regard, but when I was 19 years old, my life was a mess. I had just become a dad, wasn't married. It was a mess. I took a year off from college, tried to figure things out. And during that year, spent the year working at a store called Mervyn's. Do any of you remember Mervyn's? Whew, good sales. So I got a job at Mervyn's with my two best friends, working in shipping and receiving. And so that means that mostly we unloaded trucks, big semi-trucks, and then we took merchandise to the various departments. And there were 6 of us that worked in that department. And the head of the department was a 28-year-old guy named Don. And Don was a committed Christ follower. And I had never met anyone like him. I lived in a world with all my friends where we just all competed with each other all the time about everything. Don didn't. Like, he never viewed me as his competition. He just viewed me as someone he wanted to know. And he would ask me questions about my life. And it was cool because he was easily impressed. And when I had a story, he just listened to my story. He never tried to one-up me. He just listened and laugh and like be totally into the story with me. And after time, I was like, you know what? I trust him. Like I trust him. And here's why I trusted him. I felt like he was rooting for me. So even though he was like really old, 28 years old, and I was 19, even though he didn't drink with me or party with me and my friends, I found myself like wanting to hang out with him. And we had some common interests. We were like both health food nuts, and we were both into juicing, making carrot juice, and if you cut it with a little beet juice and a little celery and a little apple, it can do incredible things for your colon. So Don and I, we became friends over this weird stuff, and we were like really good friends. We'd get together to make juice. And he was my boss at work. But the crazy thing was at work it never really felt like that. He was just this guy that I liked being around. Now, when my son was born, it was a mess. I mean, I was 18 years old. I was 19. My son's mom was 18. She had been my high school girlfriend. We were broken up and fighting and treating each other terribly. It was awful. It was a mess. But Don cared deeply about this whole situation. He cared deeply about me being a dad. And he loved my son. And whenever I would have time with my son, Don was like all over that. And he would come out, he'd come over and just hang out with me and my baby. And I came across this about a year ago, a picture from 93. Do we have that, Cam? There we go. A little hard to see him. That's Don. That's my son, Drew. If you're a parent who's got kids that are like 20 years old or older, you might remember that contraption. It was called like a Johnny jump up. And so you hooked this thing on the door above, and then it had springs, and my son Drew loved that thing. He would sit in there and just jump and bounce, and it was like the craziest thing ever. Unfortunately, sometimes those would come disconnected from the latch and give kids brain damage and stuff, and so they got rid of those, but that never happened. We loved the Johnny jump up. But that's Don with Drew hanging out. It's kind of crazy to me that guy led me to Christ. And it's nuts because you guys know me as this amazing pastor. You guys, I was a jerk. I was selfish. And I was as closed to Jesus and Christianity as you can possibly be. And that guy led me to Christ. How did that happen? Was it because he knew just the right thing to say and he could present all the arguments in an ironclad way that could not be refuted? Not really. I mean, when we talked about stuff, he often would just kind of fumble through it. But here's what I knew. He cared about me. He rooted for me. He listened to me. And I liked him, and I trusted him enough to share my life and my pain with him. Enough to invite him into my life bit by bit, piece by piece. And as I did, his faith became real to me. And it became very, very attractive to me. And now there had been Christians prior to that had tried to evangelize me. And I'd always resisted them and I had always held them off. But for some reason, when Don talked to me about his faith in Christ, I was open. When he talked to me about Jesus, it just felt credible to me. And when I look back, part of what was happening was just that I trusted him. I saw this like deep humility in him, and I knew that he was rooting for me. I felt it from the moment I met him. And that was more persuasive to me than any apologetic or any argument that he could make. There's a historian named John Dickson who's studied like the power of humility, like this is his area of expertise. And he says this, and I totally agree with this. He says, the most believable person in the world is the person you know has your best interest in their heart. And you guys, I think that this is what people felt when they looked into the eyes of Jesus. And I will tell you that this is what I felt from my friend Don. And because of that, he changed my life. There was something about Don that was unlike anyone that I had ever known or been friends with. And it turns out it was Jesus in him. It was humility. It was genuine concern for me. And the reason it stuck out, you guys, is because this is not how the world functions. But if this characterizes you, if it truly characterizes you, you can influence people. And people will notice because it's different. We're naturally drawn to humble people. People that are truly rooting for us. People that actually care about us. People that have let go of trying to impress us. People that aren't competing with us but are just cheering for us. People that can truly celebrate our successes. People that look for ways to love us and serve us and help us climb higher and achieve more and be successful. And that was Jesus. That was Jesus. And the people around him knew it. They felt it. And I believe this is why people responded so well to Jesus. Like he was God in the flesh, but he humbled himself. And I want to close with that powerful picture from Paul one more time. And so would you stand one more time as I read these words? Paul says, don't be selfish. Don't try to impress others. Be humble, thinking of others as better than yourselves. Don't look out only for your own interests, but take an interest in others too. You must have the same attitude that Christ Jesus had. Though he was God, he did not think of equality with God as something to cling to. Instead, he gave up his divine privileges. He took the humble position of a slave and was born as a human being. When he appeared in human form, he humbled himself in obedience to God and died a criminal's death on a cross. Therefore, God elevated him to the place of highest honor and gave him the name above all other names, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue declare that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father.